Hi, Sarah. Should we go ahead and get started?
I'm ready.
Awesome, me too. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to our Field Museum Learning Connection live experience. My name is Wendy Quinlan, and I'd like to introduce you to a colleague and friend of mine who's going to talk to us about her work at the Field Museum. So, please help me welcome Sara Ruane. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Wendy.
Oh, of course. We're so excited to have you today. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Field Museum? I know you work with a very special kind of creature.
That's true. So, I am the assistant curator of amphibians and reptiles, which collectively is known as herpetology. And the word herp, or herpes for that matter, means to crawl. And so, what it refers to is the lifestyle of many reptiles and amphibians where they're low to the ground and they're crawling along. And so, what I focus on in my research is reptiles and amphibians. Very specifically, I specialize in snakes. And what I really want to know about snakes in particular is how are they related to each other? How did they get to where they live? So if you have snakes that live someplace like Madagascar, did they originate on the island of Madagascar, or did an ancestral species come from mainland Africa? Are they so old that they were there when Africa and Madagascar and India were still one continent or one big landmass? And so I'm very interested in knowing how these species are related to each other and how they got to where they live and what causes them to speciate in the first place and give us all the diversity that we see in snakes.
Oh my gosh. So that is a lot of cool stuff. And I think for a lot of our listeners and watchers right now, they think about the Field Museum and they think, well, there's nothing live there. What is somebody doing there, right? That studies snakes. So just to clarify for us, you study live snakes and snakes that are stored, that are specimens?
Absolutely. So there's different kinds of information I can get for the research that I do from live snakes versus snakes that have been previously collected and stored in the museum's collection. And so for me, what's super exciting is the part where I travel somewhere or I just go out in the backyard here in Illinois and I go out and I catch snakes. And when I catch a snake, I can get a lot of information about it, right? So where was it? What was it doing? What kind of habitat is it in? What's the temperature outside? Are you expecting to see the species where you find it? Those kinds of things. You can also take DNA samples from live snakes. But on the flip side, there's things we can't learn from a live snake. For example, snakes don't typically eat every single day of their lives. Snakes eat really big stuff. If you think about a snake, they open their mouths really big. They swallow down really large prey items relative to how big they are. And because of that, they often go days, weeks, some snakes even go months without eating between meals. The chances that you are going to either see a snake eat, because they're very secretive, is low, or that you're going to come across one in the middle of eating is also low, right? So because it doesn't occur that frequently. So one kind of information that we get from specimens in museums is looking at the diet, right? Because these snakes are already dead, they're stored in a jar that you can take them out. You can, if you have a valid reason, you can cut them open and get their stomach contents. That gives us a lot of information about what snakes eat. And just a very cool side story. There's somebody that I know who is doing a study like that. They were trying to figure out all the different foods that these snakes eat. And when they opened up one of the preserved specimens to see what was inside, they actually found another snake. A lot of snakes eat other snakes. The snake they found was a totally new species to science that nobody had ever seen before in the wild.
Wow.
And it just sat there in the belly of this specimen and provided not just information that it eats other snakes, but a whole new species that was then described from that snake out of the other snake's stomach.
Oh my gosh. So it sounds like snakes and the study of snakes are really important for understanding science, right? And for understanding all the different kinds of snakes that are out there. Now, you mentioned that you study specimens of snakes, and I was hoping that you could show us one of your
Yeah,
specimens.
absolutely. So I brought a couple specimens with me, and I'm going to talk about, I think, just to make sure we have time, I'll talk about my most favorite one that's here at the Field Museum first. So the snake I'm going to take out of the jar, I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then I'll also show a video of what he looks like in life. So this
Okay, so you are taking, oh my gosh. So this snake is not alive, Sarah.
No, this snake is not alive. And if it was, I wouldn't handle it like this because it's actually a venomous species. It's a kind of viper. So you would not be just picking it up unsafely. Let me just move stuff so I can bring them up close so everybody can get a good look. All right. So here's what I want to tell you about this snake. This snake was collected back in the 1960s on an expedition from the Field Museum traveling to Iran. And the point of that expedition was to collect mammals and learn more about the mammals there. All the reptiles and amphibians that were brought back were sort of incidental or bycatch. That wasn't the point of the trip. So there were no herpetologists like myself on the trip. And so this snake was brought back. And in the 1970s, after it was brought back, some herpetologists took a look at it and they saw this tail on it, right? And if I can bring that up to the camera.
Oh, wow, that's really unique.
It's got this weird looking tail, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the scientists who were looking at the tail thought that maybe it was some sort of parasite that had caused a tumor in the snake, or some sort of growth that wasn't natural. And the snake went back into its jar and sat there for another 40 years or so. And then in about 2003, some of the same scientists went back and looked at it again and went to Iran and found another snake that had this weird little appendage on the tail. And they said, oh, that must not be a growth. And it turns out it's not a growth at all. It is a lure that looks like a little spider when it moves, that the snake uses to lure in birds who think they're getting something to eat, and then the snake eats them. So I'm going to share my screen and show you guys a video of this snake doing what it does in life.
And Sarah, what is the name of this specimen?
It's called the Spidertailed Viper.
Spider-tailed viper, very cool.
Yes, which is a pretty good name for this snake. So you see that twitching spider is not a spider. That is the tail of the snake, just like the one I have here.
Whoa.
This unsuspecting bird is trying to rip it off the snake because he doesn't know better.
So that bird really thinks it's a spider.
Yeah. And the bird was not convinced, unfortunately for the bird. The bird is not convinced that it's not a spider, even now, because he goes back in for more. And you can see that for the snake, this is a pretty effective way to find prey items like this bird and lure them in and use that tail in order to help them catch prey. And the snake drops the bird in this video, but a lot of times when venomous snakes catch something, they'll bite it. And then once they have envenomated it, they let it go so that they're not getting bit in the face, because death does not happen instantly. And so the snake will then let the item fall out of its mouth or scurry away. And then they use their tongue, right? You think of snakes as flicking their tongues out a lot. That tongue takes in all the odor molecules and it allows them to track down where that bird or that mouse or whatever they had caught went. And then they come and find it and it's already passed away and they're able to eat it without any danger to the animal, right?
So this is a really intricate process.
Yeah.
That the snake goes through to get his food.
Yep. Yeah. It's probably amongst all the snakes we know, that's probably the most fantastical sort of ornamentation that's out there for luring in prey. A lot of snakes that are vipers. So this is a kind of viper, as I said. A lot of snakes that are in the group of vipers, when they're babies or when they're young, they will have a tail tip that's a bright color, like kind of a neon green chartreuse sort of color. And they will flick it back and forth. And frogs are typically what they're focused on eating as babies. But then as they get bigger and older, they switch over to eating mammals and their tail tip sort of turns the rest of the color that they are, usually some sort of brownish color.
Wow, that is really cool. Now, Sarah, I have so many questions about snakes and different things that I think our audience will want to know. I just want to take a step back because lots of our listeners are familiar with the Field Museum. They use our collections for learning about different things in the classroom. And you mentioned that this snake was caught in the 1960s as part of an expedition. So that makes him about 50 or 60 years old, right?
Yeah.
So we would love to know, what did you take him out of and how does he stay so young looking?
I know, right? Don't we all want that secret?
Wouldn't we all
Right?
love that?
Exactly. So one of the things that you learn how to do as a scientist who uses museum collections like myself is you have to learn how to properly not just collect these animals in a way that's safe for you and minimizes stress on the animal, but you also need to know how to preserve it in a way that's useful for not just you, but for generations to come, whether it's students or scientists, international researchers. People from around the world use the Field Museum's collection in order to learn more about particular organisms. And so the way that these animals are preserved is they're humanely anesthetized and euthanized before anything else happens to them. And then what is put into them is a chemical solution called formalin. And formalin is known as a fixative, and it literally fixes the animal in that position, so that after it sits for a day or two in the formalin solution, so you inject formalin into the body with a needle, and then you put it into a container and cover it with formalin as well. It soaks up the formalin and it becomes rigid. So these snakes that we have in these jars, if you unbend them, they don't stay that way. They go back into the position they were in when they were fixed. And so that fixation literally fixes them into a position. So that's the first step. The second step is then you rinse all the extra formalin off them, because formalin is not a good thing to be breathing in. It's not a good thing to be handling. So the animals, once they've absorbed all the formalin they can, you take them, you rinse them off, and you store them long-term in alcohol. So in ethanol. If you're in the field and you're in a situation where you don't have the right kind of supplies, you can in fact just get something like alcohol you would drink, like vodka, and use that temporarily for all of these steps. It will keep them preserved quite well. The problem with using just ethanol or alcohol is that they don't get that nice rigidity to them that makes them really robust to handling. You should never be rough with them, but they are not delicate once they've had that formalin fixation done to them. And it's what allows people to use, I've used snakes in my own research from over 100 years ago in order to answer really modern questions. And it's only because of those fixation techniques. So when people collect these animals, they're not just doing it for like some one-off, put it in a jar, put it away. People come back and use the same specimens over and over and over. And as technology and science advances, we've been able to do really cool things with old specimens that 20 years ago, nobody would have been able to do.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of importance in preserving museum collections for use over time, right?
Absolutely.
Can you talk to us a little bit about why you would go back to something that's so old again and again to learn something new?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of different reasons. So one of the main reasons is that sometimes the place that animal was collected has been changed in such a way that they don't live there anymore. So if it used to be a forest and now it's a city, well, if it was a forest back in 1900 and somebody collected a dozen snakes from there and it's a city now, well, that's it. The snakes don't live there anymore. And for some species, that might be it. There's a snake from Madagascar that I've gone in search of, but it's pretty clear that it's extinct. The only known specimen is a single one found in the Paris Museum in France that was collected back in the 1950s. And so there's a lot of instances where, one, the animal doesn't exist in that place anymore or even at all. Two, the animal may exist in that place, but for whatever reason, political, monetary, you can't maybe go there and see it. So that Spidertailed Viper, the specimen I showed you, that's the only one in the United States at all. There's no other specimens here. That's the holotype from which the species was described. And it's because it's not easy to go to where they're found for a variety of reasons. So if you live in the US and this is the only place that has this snake and you want to learn all about that appendage, maybe you want to do a CT scan where you can look inside the body of the animal, just like going to a medical doctor, and figure out how do the muscles attach that move that tail around. So you would go, so that's one thing you might have said, oh, well, I described it and that's it, it's done. No, we can come back and we can look at something else about it. So that's another reason. It's the only one around. I want to know, how does that tail flick back and forth? And so you might use new technology like a CT scan, which will allow you to see the muscle attachment and figure out how it is that it works, even though the snake itself is not alive.
Wow. Okay. So now I have even more questions. So you're telling us that this guy in the jar, could we see it in the jar just so everybody can know what it looks like when it's stored?
So this is there's information you can see on the label here. So it's going to say the name of the snake, scientific name, which is Pseudocerastes urachnoides. Urachnoides is referring to arachnids like spider, which is the tail. And then it says the country, Iran. And then down here, it's going to say who collected it. And I don't know this person, but we're going to assume a mammalogist. And then the date, right? So August 27th, 1968. So this information is key. Wow. This is the historical record of a time and a place where this snake existed. And you'll notice it also says type. And that refers to it being the type specimen from which the species was described, called the holotype. And that's also why it has this special red label on it here. This red string is what makes us, when we walk through the collection, it's like, oh, when you see that, you know it's a really important specimen because all other individuals in the species are based on this description.
On that one. So Sarah, when you say holotype, do you mean that guy is the best one, or do you mean he was the first one?
It's nice when it's both, but the first is the important part. So sometimes holotypes are, you know what, you're out collecting and you find a smushed snake on a road that somebody ran over, but you're sure it's a new species and you do all sorts of testing and analysis on it and everything agrees it's a new species. So that's the only one you have. The fact that it's been smushed and it doesn't look that great doesn't matter. It's still good data and it's still going to be the type specimen. Ideally, people do like it if the type specimen is in beautiful shape, but on this particular snake, you may not have been able to note the details, but whoever collected it or whoever helped, they weren't herpetologists. And I think the way they collected it was not probably very nice to the snake, like potentially somebody, and it's a venomous snake. So if somebody saw it, they may have killed it on purpose and then given it to the expedition people.
Sure.
And so its head is not in nice shape. It's kind of smashed in, but it's still the holotype because it was the only one known for 40 years.
Wow. That is so cool. So I have to ask you. Now, a lot of us watching, myself included, think about snakes and we think like, oh my gosh, those are something that maybe sometimes we feel a little bit nervous about or maybe a little bit scared of. But talking to you, there's so many cool things to learn about snakes. So what would you say to somebody that's afraid or doesn't like snakes?
So I can absolutely relate to feeling nervous or unnecessarily afraid of certain things. I am fairly phobic about wasps and yellow jackets. And I get it, right? Like I'm very, right? I get that feeling, even though I deal with them all the time when I'm out catching snakes. I never like them coming near me. It makes me feel very nervous. So I totally can relate. I never would want to make somebody feel more afraid of snakes by saying, you gotta like them, right? I totally get it. What I would say is that just because snakes might not be your favorite or you actively dislike them, doesn't mean that they're not really important in our environments. They tend to be fairly high up predators because they eat other vertebrates. And so they do help control things like diseases. So if you think about something like Lyme disease, which has one of its hosts is the deer mouse, snakes love to eat things like deer mice. And so if you say, hey, I hate snakes, we got to get rid of all the rattlesnakes in North America because they're just, bleh, right? They're disgusting, or I hate them, or and
they freak me out a little bit, right?
And they're venomous, so you don't want to step on one. But the thing is they're doing a really important service in the environment by eating things like deer mice, providing less hosts for those deer ticks, which helps keep that tick number lower than it otherwise would be. And so things like bubonic plague, hantavirus, Lyme disease, other tick-borne illnesses, those all have hosts that snakes like to eat. And so it is really important to help keep our ecosystem healthy in a sort of holistic whole way versus just focusing on one single thing. Another thing that I'd like to mention, again, you don't have to go out and say, oh, I love snakes, I want to see them. But again, the appreciation of why, not just from an environmental standpoint, but from a human helpfulness standpoint.
Yeah, of course.
It's been found that in a lot of venomous snakes, the venom is very novel for each species. Snakes that are venomous aren't venomous all in the same way. They have all these different kinds of proteins in their saliva that cause these reactions. And some of the things that can happen are things like your nervous system gets blocked up, which would make you stop breathing, or your cells start to sort of explode on the inside, which would cause internal bleeding, or your heart rate, whoosh, your heart rate goes down, you get really low blood pressure, or the opposite, you get really high blood pressure. There's all these different ways snake venom works. And one of the things that's really cool is that under controlled circumstances, the very things that make snake venom effective in killing something like a mouse, they can be harnessed and used in drugs that can help human health. So I have another snake here that I'll take out of a jar.
Oh, yay.
Right. So I have this little snake right here. This snake is very closely related to a snake we have here in Illinois called the Massasauga. This one is called the Pygmy Rattlesnake. Let me just shake him off.
Oh, look at that. Now, when you pull him out and you like touch him, what does that feel like?
It's very dry. It's like, I mean, the snake is wet because it's in the solution, liquid, right? It's in ethanol. But the snake itself, it's very smooth. It's like a very dry, the best way I describe it is it's kind of like running your hands across a piece of leather, which makes sense because people do make boots and belts out of snakes.
Sure,
right?
That does make sense, definitely.
So these are these little tiny rattlesnakes that are found in North America. You can barely even see. This snake has, I don't know how well you could see it, but it has a tiny rattle on the end of his tail.
Oh my gosh.
This particular snake, these little pygmy rattlesnakes, have something in their venom that has been found. It's been discovered by scientists. It's been isolated and then produced synthetically in a lab, but it originally comes from these snakes. And it makes a drug that keeps people from having recurrent heart attacks when they're already at risk in the hospital. So sometimes when people have a heart attack, they're at risk of having multiple heart attacks in a row. And this drug that comes from this snake venom can be given to people. It's called integralin, and it can be given to people in a hospital under a controlled circumstance, and it helps regulate and keep their blood. It thins out their blood and keeps it from clotting up or getting caught in itself, and it prevents heart attacks from occurring. And so there's a lot of different cool drugs that are made from venoms from snakes and other animals as well. And so that little pygmy rattlesnake, you might not think, oh, I love them, but they could be doing something or add something to them that allows people to do a little bit better medically for themselves.
Absolutely. So snakes play a really important role, right? They have a really important job, not just in keeping things regulated in our environment, right? But in also helping to create products like medicines that really help humans. That is so cool.
It is. And there's a lot of painkillers now that are being synthesized from snake venom. Not a snake, but a Gila monster, which is one of the only venomous lizards. There's a drug that comes from Gila monster venom that helps people with diabetes.
That is actually the perfect segue. It's like you read my mind, Sarah, because I wanted to ask you, when we learn about snakes in school, we're usually learning about them in the context of the classification of different animals, right?
Yeah.
And we usually learn about lizards around the same time as we learn about snakes. Can you tell us a little bit about how snakes and lizards are the same or different?
Yeah. So in pretty much all ways, you can think of snakes and lizards as being different versions of the same thing. Because snakes, if you were to make a family tree of snakes and lizards, snakes aren't on the outside of that tree. It's not like snakes are here and lizards are here.
Mm-hmm.
You have your tree of lizards. Snakes are just nestled right on in there. So snakes form a group of closely related organisms within lizards. So I always tell people that snakes are actually just very fancy, modified lizards. They're the best kind of lizard.
So we could say that a snake is a lizard. It's
You
just
could.
a different type of lizard.
Absolutely, you could. Snakes form a group that have characteristics that none of the other lizards have, but they are nestled well within lizards as that group, as that smaller family within the overall group, which includes both snakes and lizards. And there's one thing that's really interesting is that there are species out there of non-snake lizard that also don't have legs, but it doesn't necessarily make them a snake. Being a snake doesn't just mean you don't have legs. There's a whole bunch of characteristics that are wound up in being a snake. And one of those is the ability
wound up in being a snake. Sorry, like I had to just note that pun that you made right there. That was great. Okay.
Yeah. One of the major things is, they don't have legs, but a bunch of lizards don't have legs. What makes a snake special is the combination of no legs, being able to open their mouths up really wide. Snakes' jaws are not attached the way ours are to the top. They are just loosely held there with ligaments, so they can open their mouths down really wide. But they also, this part of their jaw right here, right, we have one piece here fused together. On a snake, this is two separate pieces that can pull apart as well.
Oh,
so
wow.
Snakes open their mouths really big. Snakes also don't have ear openings. They don't have external ears, and lizards typically do. So non-snake lizards, right? So you could be a legless lizard and not be a snake because you got big holes in the side of your head and you only open your mouth a little bit. The other thing, and I'll take a snake back out here to talk about this. Another thing is that on a lizard, when it's legless, on a lizard, most of the leglessness is tail. The lizard's body will be this big and then the tail might be super long.
Sure.
On a snake, people look at a snake so this is an Asian vine snake.
Oh, look at the color
right?
of that.
I know, right? This is one of my favorites. So these are found in Thailand and other countries in Southeast Asia, India. So on this snake, this snake goes, if we start here at its head and keep coming on up, this is all body, 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 but there's the tail right there. So the tail is only what's below my fingers, which is not insignificant, but compared to the rest of it.
So snakes actually have a very distinct or separate body and then a tail, just like other animals that have
just like other animals. Absolutely.
That is so cool. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, Sarah, we have about 1 minute left together.
Okay.
And so my final question for you is, what would you say to the students that are watching right now that are thinking about being a scientist or careers in science? What do you love about science? Those will be our parting words.
All right. So for me, going out and being able to see these animals in their native environment is sort of spectacular. Right? You go out and you see a snake and you chase it down and you catch it, and that feels, the adrenaline rush is amazing. But there's a lot more to being a scientist than doing that, because part of what I love is the relationships I have with other scientists who also love doing science, and you have these friends that you only would know through doing science. So I have a really nice network of people that I really like, and it's all through my work.
Mhm.
which is great. Being here at the Field Museum is one of the ways I get to hang out with other scientists and
Mhm.
talk about science, but also about other stuff. And for anything you're interested in, there's science for that, right? You're interested in snakes. You could study their diets, you could study how they're related to each other, genetics, venom, making venom into drug. You're interested in medicine and snakes or animal venom in general, right? So you could be looking at the medical side of things. And
Mhm.
not just that, you could be a doctor who works on how to best treat snake bites, right? Which is,
Right.
an unfortunate problem that we can have.
Mhm.
Um, but you could be interested in slugs. You could be interested in rocks. You could be interested in space, right?
Mhm.
There is a branch of science and a specialty within all of those branches that can be a job.
Yeah.
So if I always have wanted to do this ever since I was a little kid, I wasn't quite sure how.
Yeah.
And it's because I had a boss, a professor when I was an undergrad in college who I worked for as a work study student. And I thought maybe I'd be a veterinarian because if you like animals, that seems like a really natural way to go because it seems obvious or it's what you know about. But he said, you don't need to be a vet. If what you want to do is ask questions about wild animals, especially snakes, you should consider an academic pursuit like go to graduate school. And then if you go to graduate school, you could become a professor and run a research lab, or you can
Mhm.
become a museum curator and run a research program. So there's a lot of options out there that aren't just the obvious one when it comes to scientific careers. And I would encourage everybody to explore all those options and reach out. If you find somebody, use Google up, whatever it is you're interested in. If you come across somebody with a web page who does that thing, you can shoot them an email and ask them for any advice on how to pursue it. I get emails like that all the time. And one last thing I'll say is don't be afraid to ask people who have the kind of job that you might be interested in
Yeah.
for advice or to talk to them. I was so afraid to talk to college professors when I was 18,
Mhm.
but then to think somebody would be afraid to talk to me seems ludicrous, right? Like it seems so weird to me to think anybody would be
Mhm.
afraid to approach me. Um, but it's true. So I would say, follow what you're interested in and don't let being a little bit afraid of things ever stop you from getting more information or trying to make it work.
That is such great advice. And I think that is the perfect note to end on. Sarah, thank you so much for spending this
My
time with us.
pleasure.
It was so great to meet you and to hear about your career at the Field Museum. For everybody that's watching, thank you for joining us for the Field Museum Learning Collection Live Student Experience. We're so happy you were here and we wish you all a great day. Take care.
Bye.